Hello and welcome to Jessie Bear Book Club. Today I want to talk about The Witness Wore Red, the 19th wife who brought polygamous cult leaders to justice, by Rebecca Musser and M. Bridget Cook. I have wanted to read this book for ages, and seeing as we are now in another lockdown and I needed a break from all things Tudor, I thought this would be the perfect occasion. This review has been broken into two parts as it is so long. The second part of this review will be coming out next week. Anybody who knows me well knows I am completely fascinated by religious fundamentalism of any sort, and I take a special interest in polygamist cults. I have watched numerous documentaries on the FLDS, but this was the first book I have read on the subject, and it was gripping, and in a way it lifted the veil on polygamy in a way television never could. I listened to this book on Audible. Don't worry, this isn't a promotion, but I loved the fact the book was narrated by Rebecca Musser herself. It gave the experience of reading it more depth. I really enjoyed the fact as well this book included a PDF. I thought that was a great touch, and more audiobooks should include PDFs because I really enjoy looking at photographs, especially in autobiographies. The book opens when Becky is about 5, describing her life as a middle child to the second wife in a FLDS family. Becky tells how her mother would tell her children fables and stories to get her kids to behave, but also to keep sweet and fear the gentile world. Becky's mother grew up in the 1950s and lived through the raids on the FLDS during that period. Becky's mother really did fear the outside world due to these raids in her childhood. The book also covers Becky's father and his first wife's conversion to the FLDS from regular Mormonism, and how his first wife, known as Aunt Irene, hated Becky's mother, the second wife, and all her children, and would verbally and physically abuse the children when possible. While the first wife, Irene, got to live in the house, Becky's mother and her children had to live in the basement, which was far too small as Becky's mother was continually pregnant. Chapter 2 and 3 talk about Becky's younger brothers being born, and how Becky's mother and her whole family of children would go and visit her grandparents, and how Becky always felt safe with her grandparents in their plural family, which was so different and happy from her own. She also discovered on one of these visits that though her mother always seemed sweet and calm, she was very worried about what Irene could possibly do to her children. These chapters also cover Becky's growing love of music and her talent for playing the violin. The book then talks about the rise of Rulon Jeffs as prophet after the death of Uncle Roy. But Becky is still very young at this time and doesn't pay much attention. Becky and her siblings moved school from a state school to Alta Academy, which is run by the FLDS. She goes on to explain how strict the school was, but she was happy to be there because it was considered an honor. However, she did fear the principal, Rulon Jeffs, who would make examples of children for slight misbehavior and beat them. The book covers Becky hitting puberty and realizing her father is now more protective of her. She is also growing to fear having to marry an old man. She is also becoming more aware of Rulon Jeffs and how weird he is. She really fears what goes on in his office behind closed doors, but in her naive way she fears it is being locked in a cupboard. Chapter 4 focuses on Rulon Jeffs and Rulon Jeffs predicting the end of the world, and how Becky stopped enjoying school because Irene cooked up a plot to get her in trouble by sending a fake note from a boy. The whole thing is very disturbing, and I cannot help but think Irene is sinisterly vindictive in her actions towards the child. This chapter describes Becky's life up until she is 18, and tells of how Rulon Jeffs was obsessed with Waco, Texas. Telling children the same would happen to them, he terrified the children in his school into obedience. Chapter 5 is all about matchmaking and being married off. It mainly focuses on Becky's older sisters being married off. It also starts to focus on the age gap marriages being arranged more frequently, and now how people have absolutely no choice in who they marry, especially young women. The chapter also talks about how Becky's father has a change of heart and is now willing to sell his daughters off to old men, if it means preferment within the church. Becky loves her father, and that comes across throughout the entire book, but I cannot help thinking this man sold his daughters off like broodmares to old men to be molested. There is a political rivalry building between Becky's father and Rulon Jeffs. Becky's father is going to offer everything he can, even his children, to stay in favor. What a medieval mindset. Becky's father offers his daughter Christine, who is in her early 20s, as a bride for the 84-year-old prophet. This marriage makes Becky feel sick, and for the first time in her life she questions her faith slightly. I think that marriage would make anybody feel sick, including myself. Becky graduates Alta Academy and becomes a teacher in her old school, but very quickly she and her older sisters, Savannah and Brittany, are called up to get husbands given to them by the prophet. Becky discovers in her interview with the 84-year-old prophet he plans to marry her, and she is disgusted by the idea and cannot bear to tell anybody. Her sisters, Savannah and Brittany, are to marry men in their 50s, which is also disgusting. Becky gets a few weeks of reprieve to make her wedding dress and travels with her sister Brittany to Canada as Brittany starts married life. Becky feels very defiant at this time and wants to rebel, but ultimately doesn't because her sisters plead with her not to, and she knows her actions will reflect badly on her family. The FLDS seem to be filled with family guilt trips to get people to stay in line and keep sweet. During this time, Becky is very wrapped up in her own world and doesn't realize her sister Brittany is very unhappy until Brittany unburdens herself to her and tells her her husband has forced them to consummate their marriage even though she begged him for more time. This is nothing short of rape. Becky feels sick but doesn't know why really. She doesn't even know what consummating a marriage means. But she thinks her new husband is far too old and reassures herself Christine has never had a baby by Rulon Jeffs, so is possibly incapable. That hope is short-lived, however. Chapter 6 describes Becky's wedding as a blur, but Becky is very grateful to find all her new sister wives are kind. Becky is also very grateful that on her wedding night, Rulon only asks her to put him to bed and kiss him goodnight before she sleeps next to him. Becky is also grateful to discover that Rulon's many wives take it in turns to spend the night with him. Becky is hurt though when 5 days after her marriage Rulon announces he will be marrying more young women, and one is another Becky. Even though Becky doesn't love Rulon and always knew she would have to share him, his actions still hurt her deeply. Becky goes back to teaching and quickly forms friendships with her sister wives, especially Pauline, who she works with. But she also discovers there is a lot of infighting between Rulon's wives for the favorite top spot. Rulon's favorite young wife is Naomi, who tries to teach Becky some sexual techniques, which Becky is completely disgusted by. Becky learns a new term during this time, sugar wife, and Naomi is definitely Rulon's sugar wife. Becky goes to a lot of public appearances with Rulon and his bishops and is disgusted by how they talk about sex. Rulon will even grope Becky in restaurants if there are no FLDS members around. She also discovers, to her horror, every time she spends a night with Rulon he goes a little further touching her. Becky is becoming very down on herself, especially as Rulon's gropings are becoming more invasive, and she decides to throw herself into work, becoming very involved in plays and theatre in the FLDS community. Rebecca Musser is a very resilient, pragmatic woman, and I think that is why I enjoyed the book so much. Becky is somewhat content, but her family home is becoming more unsettled. Her father has finally taken a third wife, Becky's 20-year-old cousin named Martha, who is very strict, and manipulates Becky's father into beating his younger children to establish dominance. Her father even kicks out her older brother Cole for trying to stop the beatings. No one in Becky's family talked to Cole for 7 years after this event. Becky's younger brothers start acting out and taking drugs and going to raves, and one day Becky's father beats one of her younger brothers so badly he breaks all the bones in her hand. After this, Becky and Christine get together to inform Rulon about the abuse that is going on in their family home. Becky's father is expunged from the priesthood, and her mother and younger siblings go to live at the grandfather's old farm. But her grandfather is long dead and the farm work is hard. Becky and Christine go to the farm to try and offer comfort, but it is cold and the young boys want to run away. Becky hates the fact her brothers are doing drugs but empathizes with them. Becky's mother and Christine go for a meeting with the prophet and do not return for weeks. When they finally return, their father is with them and everything is supposed to go back to normal. But Becky's father is still acting erratically and is hyper-suspicious of his children, especially Becky and Christine, because he blames them for everything that has just happened. Becky is trying to avoid Rulon's sexual advances and failing to. She hates Rulon for this and questions whether the prophet is all-knowing, because he certainly doesn't know that she hates him. I find it hard to believe that a grown-up could believe in some sort of magic power, but I suppose that is why I find religion fascinating, and cults even more so. Rulon complains of Becky's unwillingness in bed to Warren, who then berates Becky. It is a vicious cycle that goes on for years. Becky finds comfort in her work and her theatre projects, and forms close friendships with some of her sister wives and work colleagues, which help her get through things. I really hate the way that everyone in the FLDS calls each other mother and father, or aunt and uncle. The way all the sister wives call Rulon father creeps me out, as does the fact the 40-something-year-old Warren calls the 23-year-old Becky mother. Ugh, gives me the heebie-jeebies. Over the years, Rulon has continued to marry many more young women, but all of a sudden he has a stroke and is taken to hospital, but he doesn't recover quickly. All the wives have to fast and pray as the weeks go on, but there is no improvement in the prophet's state. The only people who are allowed to visit Rulon are Warren and his brothers and some of the sister wives, but nobody at all is allowed to tell the people how sick Rulon really is. When Rulon finally gets out of hospital, he is still unwell and talks nonsense from time to time, which frightens Becky. Warren starts telling people his father is communing with God, but Becky simply thinks he is dying. Even with all the FLDS brainwashing, Becky is still pragmatic and sensible. Becky is hyper-aware Warren won't let people see the prophet, and slowly realizes Rulon has moments of lucidity, but then will be forced to have a snack by one of his sons and be nonsensical. She figures out, after a while, that Warren and his brothers are drugging their 89-year-old father to secure their own power. Becky is disturbed by this, but decides not to say anything openly, as all of Rulon's wives are basically under house arrest with him, and she is stuck with no contact with the outside world apart from a hidden pager. There is a lot of grumbling in the church that men are not allowed to see the prophet, and Warren starts handing out teen brides like candy to keep men sweet. He starts marrying younger and younger girls to older and older men, to perhaps blackmail them? Or simply bribe them. During this time, Becky's mother is taken from her husband and married to a man everybody calls Uncle Fred. Becky knows this marriage was designed by Warren and is political, but tries to be okay with it. But then Becky's 13-year-old sister Eliza is to be married to her first cousin at the urging of Uncle Fred. Becky is disgusted by this, and knows she has to try and do something to stop it. Eliza is betrothed to her 26-year-old cousin, who Becky knows will mistreat her baby sister. Becky and Christine and their mother plead for Eliza to have more time, but Warren is adamant the wedding will go ahead. Eliza decides to ask the prophet to intercede, and Becky and Christine arrange for Rulon to be lucid that day. Rulon is disgusted at the idea of a first cousin marriage, and repulsed by the idea Eliza is only 14, but Warren bullies the old man into agreeing. Eliza is married and raped nightly and completely miserable. Becky is disgusted she was not able to help, and when she thinks about it she cannot stop vomiting. Rulon Jeffs was not a nice man by any means, but compared to his son Warren he is a saint. I think it is very interesting how distinctly throughout this book Becky draws a line between Rulon and Warren. Becky acknowledges Rulon was not innocent, and knows the rot set in when Rulon brought in one-man rule, but she views Warren as the monster he truly is. Honestly, I do not think the difference between the two men is as great as Becky thinks it is. Rulon, if he had been younger, would possibly have been just as bad as Warren. Then Rulon dies and Warren starts vying to be the next prophet. At the time of Rulon's death, Warren was in an ongoing fight with the Bishop of Canada, and Canada ends up breaking away from the FLDS, and Warren, causing a spiritual civil war. Becky is very worried as her sister Brittany still lives in Canada. The Canadian FLDS people are fasting a lot, and Brittany seems very unwell when she phones to talk to Becky. One of the main reasons why Canada broke away from the FLDS and Rulon Jeffs was because Warren kept predicting the end of the world, and it kept not happening. Warren continually predicts the end of the world throughout the book, which obviously doesn't happen as we're all still here. No wonder the Canadian FLDS people were disillusioned. Even Becky questions how Warren keeps getting this wrong if he is the new prophet. After Rulon's funeral, Becky starts to worry that she will be married, but is slightly heartened when Warren tells men to stay away from the prophet's wives. But then it occurs to her, perhaps Warren wants his father's wives for himself. She is disgusted by the idea and asks her sister Christine, her fellow sister wife, if such a thing would be possible, and is disgusted when Christine is overjoyed at the idea of marriage to Warren. Then one morning Warren simply turns up with 7 of his father's wives and announces that they came to him and had revelations that told them to marry him. All the remaining wives are instructed to pray and wait to be told by God through a revelation who they should marry. Slowly more and more of Rulon's wives start marrying Warren, and Becky watches as Warren manipulates people to stay in power. He even lets Naomi, the first one of his father's wives he married, to testify in church, something that is nearly unheard of in FLDS culture. This is the end of the first part of this book review. Make sure to subscribe to this channel so you will not miss the second part of this book review, which is coming out next week, and leave a comment with your thoughts on the FLDS. Remember to like this video because it helps out the channel. Until next time, remember to keep sweet. Bye!